I want to welcome Sarah Steininger. She is the Deputy Director of LifeWire, and she will be presenting and speaking with us today about domestic violence. So please welcome Sarah.
So it's true. I am the Deputy Director and right now Interim Executive Director at LifeWire. We're formerly Eastside Domestic Violence Program. We've been in existence for 30 years now. And I've been with the organization for about 10. This year is my 10-year anniversary. And we are doing some really great, innovative work in the community around intimate partner violence. And I'm here to talk to you both about that and some of the intersections between intimate partner violence and healthcare and the rest of the community. So LifeWire's vision is that human rights, that domestic violence is a human rights issue. And we envision a world where everyone lives in a safe environment and has access to the same resources, that they live free from oppression and with opportunities to thrive in their lives. And our mission is to end domestic violence. We do that through both services that we offer, and I'll go through a long list of the services that we offer, and also by doing prevention work. And we have actually just hired a new social change manager who is developing a strategy to do prevention in the community, and he's really focusing on engaging with young men and boys through a number of different methods, but especially working in the school system with coaches. So if any of you have children who are in athletics, consider talking to your coach, talking to your children's coaches about the program that we hope to launch in the next couple of months called Coaching Boys into Men. So our services, in brief, are our 24-hour helpline. The helpline is the access point, the window or the doorway to all of the rest of our services. We also offer individual domestic violence advocacy, safe confidential housing services, and that is in a whole range everywhere from what most people traditionally think of when they think of domestic violence services, which would be emergency confidential shelter programs, everywhere to transitional housing, and what is now being called Housing First, but really it's rental assistance programs and a variety of other financial assistance to help people stay in their existing housing in safe ways. We offer legal advocacy, therapy services, peer support groups, children and youth support groups, multilingual services, particularly in Spanish and Russian, and community education and prevention, like I talked about earlier. I'm going to talk just a little bit about how LifeWire defines domestic violence. And this is according to the Washington State Administrative Code, so this would be actually the laws that govern the type of work that we do. And it's a pattern of assaultive and coercive behaviors that an adult or adolescent uses to maintain power and control over their intimate partner. And so that is why I use the term intimate partner violence interchangeably with domestic violence. And I think that it is a little bit more specific to what we're talking about, because everything that you all are saying about violence towards children, like child abuse specifically, elder abuse when it's not in the context of an intimate partner relationship, and other things like that, all fall under kind of our general both community and legal definition of domestic violence, and are not things that LifeWire works with specifically when they are not part of an intimate partner relationship. Now, that said, all of these different types of violence are interrelated and tend to kind of come in a package deal. So we do see child abuse very closely correlated with intimate partner violence. We also see elder abuse very closely correlated. And so we are interested in all of the issues that fall under that broader umbrella of domestic violence. But what I will be speaking about specifically today will be intimate partner violence. So I talked a little bit just now about the behavioral definition, and I'll just go back to that for a second. What we're focused on is the pattern of power and control. And the criminal legal system uses a different definition. They say that domestic violence is physical harm, bodily injury, assault, including sexual assault, stalking, or inflicting fear of imminent physical harm, bodily injury, or assault between family or household members. And so it's very focused on specific behaviors that mostly are composed of physical and sexual assault. And while we are very concerned about those issues also and can include them in our definition, we include behaviors that would not be physical or sexual assault. So one big question that we hear is how big of a problem is this? How often does this happen? Nearly 1/3 of American women, and actually in a recent study here in King County, it found that it was closer to 40% of women between the ages of 15 and 55 reported being physically or sexually abused by a husband or boyfriend at some point in their lives. That's a lot. And it's not just men, although the statistics that we see are the vast majority of abusers are men. Now, that is in part because of the way these surveys are conducted, and so it's always important to think critically of the way that statistics can frame intimate partner violence in particular. And it is one of the main reasons that when I'm talking about it, I really try not to use gendered language, because we do understand that domestic violence happens in all communities, and that LGBTQ folks also experience intimate partner violence, and so women experience violence at the hands of other women, men experience violence at the hands of other men, and on a much less frequent basis, we do see women battering men as well. So another question that I hear is like, what is a commonality between people that we see coming into our services? And one of my coworkers gave me this comic, and I think it's kind of funny, but you may not be able to read it. So this guy right here is saying, is there perhaps something which the victims of domestic violence have in common, some clue as to why they are abused? And this character right here says, yes, the one element consistently present in all cases we studied was a violent partner. So it's a really good reminder for all of us to consider that victims or survivors of abuse are actually not complicit and not at fault for the violence that they experience. And that is going to be a guiding theme. It's something you'll hear me talk about over and over again, because it's something that we all want to look at, like, why did this happen to this person, and how can I avoid having that happen to me or the people that I love? And it comes up in all different types of contexts. So domestic violence is a learned behavior, and statistically what we understand about that is that that using violent behaviors in an intimate partner relationship is a learned behavior. Oftentimes in fact, when I used to work very closely with a lot of teens and youth, I would hear from them like, oh, well, somebody told me that because I witnessed this in my family, or I experienced this in my family, does that mean that I'm more likely to become a victim of this type of violence when I grow up? And one of the things that we say is that actually the statistics don't support that people are more likely to be victimized if they witnessed violence in their families of origin, but they are much more likely to become abusers if they witnessed intimate partner violence in their families of origin. So something really important to think about, and that in this case, statistics show that boys are at a much higher risk of going on to become abusers, particularly if the abuser that they witnessed was male. It's a patterned behavior, meaning that it repeats and escalates over time. We'll talk a little bit more about that. It's coercive and targeted. So it's really focused on one person, or possibly, if we're talking about a family, that it may include the children in that dynamic. But it's not a situation where the person who is doing the battering is going to be abusive in all other parts of their lives. In fact, oftentimes, and I hear this from survivors all the time, that person is actually a well-respected member of the community, and people cannot possibly believe that they would do that to some. And it's what supports that ongoing battering, because people don't believe it. Like I said before, it's present in all groups, ages, races, sexual identities, religions, occupations, income, and education levels. A little bit more about what domestic violence is, meaning what behaviors do we kind of fit under that umbrella. And so I think we all think of physical and sexual abuse and other intimidating tactics and stalking. But we also really look at physical and psychological isolation of the intended victim. That makes someone much more vulnerable. And in your work, particularly for those of you who are healthcare providers, isolation is a huge risk factor, a huge vulnerability for violence, but both in intimate partner violence and in elder abuse. Repeated attacks against the victim's competence, basically saying you're stupid, you can't do anything, no one would ever want you, you'll never make anything of yourself. Control of family funds and resources. This is something I see almost universally in every case that I've worked with, that there is some control over the resources or finances available to the family. Use of the children and systems. And when we talk about systems, we're talking about really any institution that the survivor might interact with. So that can include the legal system, or DSHS, so access to things like welfare and to CPS or Child Protective Services. It can also include your systems. Oftentimes we see batterers controlling survivors' access to healthcare and to healthcare systems, or manipulating healthcare systems so that people won't believe that someone is actually experiencing violence. And this alternating use of indulgences I'm going to talk about a little bit more, but what that basically means is alternating battering behaviors like what we just talked about, the more negative behaviors, with privileges. So being really nice to someone, sorry if you can't see, being nice, being loving, giving flowers or gifts, or saying that I love you, and oftentimes being the person that the survivor fell in love with in the first place. So we use this cycle of violence. Who has seen this cycle of violence before? Great, that's great. So this can be a really helpful tool, but I want to remind you it's just a tool, and it does not describe every survivor's experience. But the reason I like to talk about it is because it really explains that alternating use of indulgences better. So I think we're all pretty familiar with this idea of there being some tension building that goes into an acute battering phase, which is where some of the worst things that you would imagine would happen. That's when those things happen. But this honeymoon stage is a little bit more confusing. And so I like to use a story to illustrate that. I was facilitating support group years ago now. And there was an older woman, she was probably in her late 70s, who reminded me, she really struck me because she reminded me of my grandmother, in that she was like this really strong, really stubborn person who had a lot of opinions, and I admired that about her. And she said, she was in a 30-year marriage that had been violent pretty much the entire time, and she described very severe physical violence. But that when she was good, when she was on her best behavior, when she did everything that her batterer wanted her to do, that he would not physically abuse her, and would wait for all of the bruises to heal, and once all of the bruises healed, he'd take her to Hawaii for 2 weeks. That trip to Hawaii, the promise of that trip to Hawaii, did more to perpetuate his pattern of power and control than the actual physical violence ever did. So it's really important to think of all of the dynamics in a relationship as being potentially abusive, and not just the ones that we all think of as being abusive or the ones that we know are illegal. And that's one of the really important things when we think about what we should do about domestic violence, or when we're working with clients or patients who may be experiencing intimate partner violence, is that just call the police is not an option for many people, in part because it may not be safe for them to call the police, in part because they may not have ever received a good response from the police, or in part because what is happening in their relationship may not be illegal. So the police can't do anything about it. And so what we do as individuals in relationship to survivors of violence is going to be really, really important, because sometimes they don't, what we think of as being the systems that are there to support people may not really be accessible to them. Any questions about that? So her question was, when the behavior is not illegal, what behaviors do I mean? And I mean, here, I'll go back here. Intimidating tactics that do not produce threat of imminent harm would be totally legal. Physical and psychological isolation, completely legal until it becomes kidnapping or hostage taking. Attacks against a person's competence, control of family resources, using children in systems, the indulgences, all of those are legal behaviors. Totally considered fine by the criminal justice system. And the criminal justice system really is not set up to police people's relationships. So it's important for us to think as a community about how we both hold batters accountable and support survivors, but also how we support people on having healthy, equal relationships. So one of the things that we're really working to do is to reframe the way that we in our communities think about intimate partner violence. To think differently about the harm that is caused by intimate partner violence, because most of the time we think of bruises and broken bones, and sometimes if you're working in mental health care, you might think of things like PTSD, anxiety and depression, and in some cases we also think about things like homicides. Or we may think about risk to children. I think those are really common things that we think about when we think about the impact. But I really want us to think differently. I want us to think about domestic violence. The effect of that overall pattern of assaultive and coercive behavior is to increase that batterer's power and control in the relationship, and to decrease the survivor's access to resources and ability to just be their own person. And so for just 1 second, I want you to think about what you did today. For me, I woke up and I took a shower and I made myself breakfast and coffee, and I went to work, and I had a whole stack of things that I was trying to get done, and half of them didn't get done before I came here. And I talked to a bunch of my coworkers, and I made several phone calls, and then I drove here. In a survivor's life, they may wake up, but I actually spoke with one survivor who was not allowed to get out of bed until her abuser told her she was allowed to. In other cases, they may not be allowed to have access to basic things that we all take for granted, like making a phone call, or driving somewhere, or going to work, or doing whatever it is that they know they should be doing in their day, making their own decisions. Yeah. So I think maybe that's a little bit of a misunderstanding. Actually, it's the police who send us an email of the police report with a request for us to contact the identified victim in the case. I'm sorry I didn't explain that. And so in those specific police referrals, we'll contact the identified victim and reach out and offer services. But some kind of important background on the type of services that we offer and the philosophy that we use. It's really, really important to us that they are survivor-driven and that people feel that it is their decision to access us, that they feel empowered and self-determined. In part because we don't want to be telling them what to do. We don't want to be telling them the right thing. And the truth is, we don't know the right thing to do. These situations are so individual and so specific to the people involved that we believe and know that survivors are the experts in their own situations. And for that reason, it's really important to us to allow survivors to guide the type of work that we're doing with them. Now, that said, if a survivor wants us to come out and visit with them, or meet them at a coffee shop, or however, whatever type of access they want to have with us, that is something that we'll work with them to do. But it does fall a little bit on that survivor to contact us, to reach out to us, or to access that support when the referral is made or when we reach out to them. Because if they don't, we're not gonna keep hounding them and say, "Are you safe? Have you made a safety plan?" Because that actually may not be very safe for them, for us to continue to reach out to them. Because for many survivors, when they first begin to access support, experience a little empowerment, maybe start to make some of their own decisions, what happens is that they begin to resist the abuse that's happening in their lives. And statistically, again, I'm a data person, so I'm so sorry if I say statistically a million times today. Statistically, we know that survivors are at a 75% increased risk of being killed by their abusive partner when they begin to resist the abuse, when they leave the relationship, when they start saying no, or start accessing resources. That can be a really dangerous time for survivors. And so we want to be very conscious of that when we begin to reach out to survivors as well. Does that answer your question? Okay, great. So again, it's really important to remember that the pattern of power and control is the most important thing here. So it's not the specific behaviors in and of themselves. In fact, sometimes survivors will use violence or what appears to be violent behaviors in order to resist abuse, or in order to survive in the situation that they're in. And here's some examples. So we have a whole list of behaviors here. We have slapping someone, shoving someone, not letting someone leave the room. I'll let you read the rest of these behaviors. So look at this picture. Everybody knows what this picture what movie this picture came from. So when you see this picture, what do you think? If you didn't know, if you hadn't seen this movie, what would you think? It's a little scary. I mean, I look at that picture and it seems a little scary. Here he is, he's brandishing a weapon. He has a scary face, very intimidating looking. There's a forward movement in the posture. He looks like a scary guy. I might even think that he was the bad guy in the movie. If we were defining this in terms of intimate partner violence, I might think that he was the abuser. But who is he? He's Frodo. He's the good guy, right? And that he uses, in his story, he uses violence at times to survive, to accomplish his mission, to do all kinds of things. And that if we just took something from a snapshot point of view and said, oh, this is what this is domestic violence, we may not fully understand what's really going on in that situation, because we really need to watch the movie. And unfortunately, what happens is when we use a criminal justice definition to understand intimate partner violence, we often miss things, as does the criminal justice system, unfortunately, which is many times the reason why survivors don't call the police, why sometimes the police response is inadequate, and sometimes actually does damage to people if, for example, if the police are called and the police are required to determine who is the aggressor if they determine that a crime has taken place, and sometimes they actually make the wrong determination, or the evidence supports something that does not reflect the overall pattern of power and control that's happening in the relationship. Does that make sense? Okay, great. So, again, abusing or surviving. The behavior itself is not the point. It's the behavior as part of a pattern of systemic power and control over the partner. So we use an acronym called ICE, and it stands for intent, context, and effect. And this is the acronym that we use to help analyze or understand an intimate partner violence situation better. And so it looks like this. Intent is, what's the goal of the behavior? Why was the behavior used? Was it used to attack someone, or to perpetuate a pattern of power and control? Or was it used to survive a pattern of power and control? Context. what has been happening in the relationship over time. So who really, like, what does that look like? What does the movie of that relationship look like rather than the snapshot? And effect, meaning whose world is getting smaller. Remember, we talked a little bit about battering and surviving, and that the real negative impact on survivors is actually not the bruises and the broken bones. It's the systematic removal of that person's rights. And this is really how we begin to understand domestic violence as being a human rights issue as opposed to a criminal justice issue. So we also know that domestic violence is rooted in oppression. And what we mean by that is that battering is not just a gender issue. That we no longer define, at least at LifeWire, we no longer define domestic violence as being a gender violence issue. Although, like we were talking about statistics earlier, we do know that the vast majority of people who are negatively impacted by domestic violence are women and children. And the way that we understand the intersection of these things is that the root of the power is much deeper. And it is about our conception of dominance and power in society, meaning that if I'm in a relationship with somebody and I want to gain power and control over them, I'm going to use pre-existing social inequalities to perpetuate my use of power. So I'm going to use the power I already have in society. And that is the way we see battering manifesting in relationships most often, which is why we see women in heterosexual relationships as victims much more often than we see them as batterers, because they have less systemic power in society than men do. It doesn't make men bad. It just means that there is less systemic power. Does that matter? Does that make sense? So quickly, why do survivors stay? They've been told that they can never do anything with themselves and they have access to no resources and they'll die. There may not actually be anywhere for them to go. Historically, our response to domestic violence was for someone to leave and go to shelter. Well, LifeWire, turns away 35 families for every one that we're able to take into our shelter. 35! That's huge. What we know about that is that shelter cannot be our main response because we can't possibly build enough capacity to serve all of those people. That number has only gone up in the last 30 years. I want everyone to think right now about why you stay in your own intimate relationships. Right? Like, it's not always good. Sometimes you're really mad at that person. And the reason you stay is the same reason why survivors stay in violent intimate partner relationships. That the violence in the relationship, while it may seem really apparent and obviously bad from the outside, it's not that apparent and obvious from the inside. It's much more complicated from the inside. And that the patterns of power and control are designed to do that. So here are some statistics, a little bit more about the prevalence and impact on healthcare and on the healthcare system. Can you see? I'll let you read these while I talk just a little bit about this. I think everyone here who works in healthcare, if you do, raise your hand just so I can kind of get a sense of the audience. Okay. You've all seen someone who has come in to your facility, your practice, who has been impacted by intimate partner violence. You may not have known it, and they may not have told you, and you may have even asked, and they didn't tell you. And part of that is because it may not be safe for them to tell you, or they may think that you won't believe them, or they're not ready. They're scared of being specifically boxed up as a survivor. They're scared of what you'll do. They're scared that you'll call CPS because you're worried about their kids. There's lots of reasons why survivors don't disclose information. And here is a brief list of possible indicators of intimate partner violence that you could look at. Now, if you were a healthcare provider and you came in after I had already put handouts out on the tables, I have an extra handout for you that is about the clinical indicators of intimate partner violence. But really, if you've been listening to the rest of the presentation, I imagine that you can kind of guess what those things would be. And anytime you have any concern, just ask. That's really all. and I'm assuming after all of the work that we've done that most of you already have these questions on your intake forms and on your on the forms that you use when you're meeting with someone in a primary care setting. So the bottom line is really just ask. And as to why, not only does early intervention actually help reduce risk, which we know about almost all health risk factors, it also, you want to definitely be respectful of safety and confidentiality, but it can also support safety and confidentiality. And if abuse isn't present, raising the topic is not going to be offensive. In fact, every time my doctor asks me, I thank her and say, I'm so glad you're actually doing this because this is really going to help someone who is experiencing intimate partner violence. And even if, like I said before, even if patients don't feel safe disclosing it to you, they may the next time, so keep asking. As to how to ask the question privately, meaning not when the person's partner is in the room. That should seem pretty obvious, but especially when if you're doing any OBGYN and prenatal visits and things like that, oftentimes a person's partner does come into the room with them and they want to be present for the whole thing. And actually, pregnancy is a very high risk time for someone who is experiencing intimate partner violence. And so something to think about with that is to maybe say to them, you know, with every patient of mine, I want to speak with them privately without their partner, just to talk, just to chat about, you know, you could even, if the person is, if you can even use gendered things like I just want to talk about lady things or whatever you need to do to try to get them in a room privately so that you can ask the question in a confidential way. Assist with accessibility if necessary, so get an interpreter if you need that, and really any other things that might improve accessibility. We talked about confidentiality, and with HIPAA laws, I'm sure that you understand confidentiality, but that is very important in relationship to safety. Do it all the time, do it repeatedly, do it every single time you see the person. Do it orally and face-to-face. And on any written surveys that you provide, ask the question again. Use direct, non-judgmental language. Some examples of that might be, oh, you know, this may not be an issue for you, but I ask all of my patients this, and I ask them over and over again, so I may start to sound like a broken record, but do you feel safe in your home? Do you feel safe in your relationship? Are there any issues of violence or abuse that you would like to talk to me about? And even if they say no, provide things like brochures and crisis line cards like what I handed out to you in your waiting rooms and in your bathrooms. So that, and say, you know, even especially if you're really concerned, say, you know, even if you don't want to tell me, there are resources that are available for people who experience abuse in their relationships, and there are resources available in the bathroom and in the waiting room if you want to grab something. How to help? Don't blame them for the abuser's behavior. And there's so many ways that we unintentionally do that by doing things like, well, you know, it takes two to tango. What are you doing that might make this worse? Right? Especially when we think about relationships, we do tend to want to talk about them from a more equal standpoint. And that's not helpful when we're talking about abuse. Remain patient, open-minded, and supportive. Something to know is that survivors, on average, leave 7 times before they leave for good. I'm seeing hand signals from the side. I do need to wrap up here, and I'm really happy to talk to anyone both here or if you want to call our crisis line if you ever have any questions about how to do this stuff. Thank you all. Thank you for all your questions.